The old man sat by the window, a small island of stillness in a sea of quiet chatter. The restaurant, a place called Le Chardonneret, was the kind of spot where people went to be seen, a cavern of soft lighting, crisp white tablecloths, and the clinking of expensive silverware. It smelled of roasted garlic, fresh lilac, and a faint, sweet perfume that seemed to hang in the air like a mist. He was a visitor in this world, and he knew it. His name was Arthur, and at 73, he felt like a living photograph from a different era, faded at the edges and placed in a frame that didn't quite fit. His suit, a respectable but dated tweed, had seen better decades. It was the same one he'd worn to his dear wife's funeral 10 years ago now. He kept it for special occasions, though he couldn't remember the last time he'd had one of those before tonight. Tonight was different. Tonight wasn't about celebration. It was about a quiet, personal pilgrimage. He had saved for months to afford just a single course here, a bowl of French onion soup, because this place held a ghost of a memory for him. He looked down at his hands, resting on the starched tablecloth. They were spotted with the brown maps of age, the knuckles swollen, the skin thin as paper. But underneath the wrinkles, he could still see the shape of them as they once were strong, nimble, and capable of painting magic across 88 ivory keys. His gaze drifted, as it had every few minutes since he'd arrived, to the grand piano standing in the corner of the dining room. It was a magnificent beast, black and glossy, so polished it reflected the candlelight from each table like a dark, still lake. It looked perfect, powerful, and utterly silent. A string quartet was playing on a small raised platform across the room, their music pleasant and unobtrusive, a soft soundtrack for the clinking wine glasses and murmured business deals. They were good, technically perfect, but their music was like the restaurant itself, beautiful, but with no soul. It was background noise. The piano, on the other hand, stood like a sleeping giant, waiting for a story to be told. Arthur watched the other diners. A woman in a shimmering green dress laughed loudly, tossing her hair back. A man with a thick gold watch gesticulated wildly, explaining some big deal to his companions. They all seemed so confident, so wrapped up in their own importance. He felt invisible, a piece of forgotten furniture tucked by the window. And in a way he hadn't touched a piano in nearly 50 years. Not since the accident. Not since the world had become too loud and the music inside his head had become a source of pain rather than joy. He had built a quiet life after that, a small life, working in a library, mending books, and finding a different kind of peace in the silence. But lately the silence had felt heavier, more like an emptiness. The music, the old melodies, had started to creep back into his thoughts, faint at first, then louder. Like a ghost knocking on the door of his heart, he finished his soup. The rich broth and melted cheese a small comfort. He placed the spoon carefully beside the empty bowl, folded his linen napkin into a neat square, and took a slow, deep breath. It was now or never. A nervous energy, something he hadn't felt in a lifetime, fluttered in his chest. It felt both terrifying and exhilarating. He wasn't doing this for them, for the people in their expensive clothes. He was doing it for himself, to see if he still could, to see if the ghost was still there. Waiting to be brought to life, he caught the eye of the maître d', a tall, stern-looking man named Jean-Pierre who moved between the tables with the practiced grace of a ballet dancer. Jean-Pierre's eyes scanned the room, missing nothing, his expression a mask of professional politeness. When his gaze met Arthur's, there was a flicker of something else, curiosity, perhaps, or even a bit of pity for the old man dining alone. Arthur gave a small, hesitant nod. Jean-Pierre glided over, his back ramrod straight. "Was everything to your satisfaction, monsieur?" he asked, his voice smooth and low. "Oh, yes, thank you." "It was lovely," Arthur replied, his own voice sounding a bit thin to his ears. He cleared his throat. "I was just wondering, I have a rather unusual request." Jean-Pierre raised a perfectly sculpted eyebrow, waiting. Arthur gestured with a slight tilt of his head toward the corner. "The piano. I see it's not being used this evening. I play a little." I was wondering if it might be permissible for me to play a small tune while I wait for my main course. He said it quickly, as if to get the words out before he could lose his nerve. Just one or two songs. I would be very quiet. Jean-Pierre's mask of politeness cracked for just a second, replaced by a look of sheer bewilderment. He blinked, processing the request as if it were spoken in a foreign language. An old man in a tweed jacket asking to play the grand piano at Le Chardonneret? It was absurd. Before he could formulate a polite but firm refusal, a loud, booming voice cut through the soft music of the quartet. Well, I'll be. Did you hear that, Giselle? The voice called out. It came from a table nearby, where a man in a tailored suit, his face tanned and his smile full of perfect white teeth, was leaning back in his chair with an air of great amusement. This was Sterling, a regular who was known for his deep pockets and even deeper need for attention. He had a way of making everything a spectacle, and tonight it seemed Arthur was to be his entertainment. The old gent wants to provide the music for us, Sterling announced to his table, his voice dripping with condescension. His date, a glamorous blonde named Giselle, giggled behind her hand. The others at the table, a mix of men and women dressed in the height of fashion, all turned to look at Arthur, their expressions a mixture of shock and amusement. I do hope he knows more than just chopsticks, Sterling quipped, earning a round of snickers from his companions. Maybe we can all sing along. Another one of them chimed in. I think I have a few coins for his hat. The group roared with laughter, their cruel jokes echoing in the space that had, just moments before, been filled with quiet elegance. The whole dining room seemed to hold its breath, the soft music from the quartet suddenly sounding distant and thin. All eyes were on Arthur. He felt a hot flush creep up his neck, but he didn't look at them. He kept his gaze fixed on Jean-Pierre, his face a calm, unreadable mask. He had expected this on some level. The world hadn't changed that much. It still judged a book by its cover. Jean-Pierre was now trapped. He was flustered, his professional composure shaken by the unwanted attention. He didn't want to cause a scene, but allowing this strange old man to play was out of the question. It would disrupt the ambiance of his restaurant. He looked from Arthur's calm, steady face to the smirking, expectant faces of Sterling's table. He was caught between politeness and policy, between a quiet request and a loud mockery. The pressure was on, and the whole room was watching to see what he would do. Arthur simply sat there, a small, patient figure in the storm of their ridicule, waiting for an answer. The silence in the restaurant stretched, thin and brittle. It was a heavy blanket woven from stares and unspoken thoughts. Jean-Pierre, the maître d', felt a single bead of sweat trace a cold path down his temple. His entire career was built on maintaining an atmosphere of effortless elegance, a world where small disturbances were smoothed over before they could ripple. But this was no small disturbance. This was a rock thrown into the placid pond of his dining room, and the waves were crashing against the shores of his composure. He looked at the old man Arthur, who sat with the patience of a stone statue, his gaze unwavering. Then he looked at Sterling, whose smug expression was a challenge. To refuse the old man now would be to side with the bully, a subtle but undeniable act of cruelty that would taint the evening's air. To allow him to play was to risk a disaster, a cacophony that would ruin the ambiance and anger his other patrons. He was trapped between a rock and a very hard place. Sterling, sensing the maître d's hesitation, decided to apply more pressure. He leaned back in his chair, the expensive leather creaking softly, and raised his voice just enough for the tables around him to hear. "Come on, Jean-Pierre! Where's your sense of adventure? Let the man have his moment. It could be the highlight of the evening. We can all pretend we're at a quaint little village pub." His friends chuckled, a chorus of privileged amusement that grated on the nerves. One of them, a woman dripping in diamonds, pulled a small, elegant coin purse from her clutch. "I'll start the tip jar," she whispered, her voice laced with venomous sweetness. That was the tipping point for Jean-Pierre. The cruelty was no longer covert. It was a performance. And in that moment, the quiet dignity of the old man seemed to shine brighter, a silent rebuke to the loud arrogance of the wealthy patrons. He straightened his back, a flicker of something like resolve in his eyes. He would not be a party to this humiliation. He would let the old man play. If it was a disaster, so be it. It would be a more honest sound than the laughter coming from Sterling's table, with a stiff, formal nod that was more for Arthur than for the hecklers. Yang Pierre spoke, his voice clipped and precise. "Very well, monsieur. You may play." He added a condition, a last-ditch attempt to control the situation. "But quietly, if you please. We have other guests." It was a weak addition, and he knew it. The room was now Arthur's stage, whether anyone wanted it to be or not. A strange energy shifted in the room as Arthur slowly pushed his chair back. The soft scrape of its legs against the polished floor was the only sound. The string quartet, sensing the change in the atmosphere, had fallen silent, their instruments resting in their laps. Their cellist, a young woman with serious eyes, watched Arthur with a look of professional curiosity. The murmurs from the other tables died down, replaced by a palpable sense of anticipation. It was as if the entire restaurant was holding its breath. This was no longer just a dinner. It was an event. Arthur began his walk toward the piano. It was a short distance, no more than 20 feet, but it felt like a mile-long journey. Each step was measured and deliberate. He didn't hurry. He didn't look left or right. He kept his eyes fixed on the grand black instrument waiting for him in the corner. He could feel the dozens of eyes on him, a physical weight on his shoulders. He saw the reflections in the darkened windows, the silhouettes of heads turned in his direction. He heard the whisper of a woman to her companion, "Poor man, they're setting him up for a fall." He ignored it all. In his mind, he was walking down a different corridor, a long time ago. He was walking toward a stage in a concert hall, the air thick with expectation, his heart pounding with a mixture of terror and exhilaration. He was young again, his hands strong and sure, the future a blank page of musical possibilities. As he passed Sterling's table, the smell of expensive cologne and red wine filled his nostrils. Sterling didn't say anything, but he made a show of looking at his expensive wristwatch, a theatrical gesture of impatience that drew a few snickers from his friends. Arthur didn't flinch. He simply kept walking, a solitary figure on a lonely pilgrimage. He was not doing this for them. He was doing it for the young man he used to be, for the wife who had always believed in him, and for the quiet, gnawing ache in his soul that had demanded he try one last time. He reached the piano and stood before it for a moment. It was even more magnificent up close. The black lacquer was so deep it seemed to drink the light. The ivory keys, yellowed slightly with age, seemed to glow in the soft candlelight. It smelled of old wood, wax, and the faint, dusty scent of history. He ran a hand gently over the smooth, cool surface of the lid, a gesture of familiarity and reverence. This was his old friend, his oldest enemy, his first love, and his greatest sorrow. It had been 50 years since he had last felt this connection, 50 years since he had promised himself he would never play again. He reached for the bench, a simple, sturdy wooden stool, and pulled it out. The scrape of its legs against the floor was louder this time, a sharp, definitive sound that cut through the silence. He sat down, the old wood groaning softly under his weight. He adjusted his position, his back straight, his feet finding the pedals. He placed his wrinkled, spotted hands on his knees, taking a deep, slow breath to steady his nerves. His heart was hammering against his ribs, a frantic drumbeat in the quiet of the room. He could feel a tremor in his fingers, a combination of age and adrenaline. He flexed them slowly, one by one, trying to coax the muscles into remembering. Sterling, unable to resist one last jab, called out, his voice echoing in the hushed room. "Take your time, Grandpa. We're all on the edge of our seats." A few people gasped softly at the rudeness, but Sterling just laughed, a harsh, grating sound. Arthur didn't turn around. He simply closed his eyes for a second, blocking out the world, the noise, the cruelty. He saw his wife's face in his mind, her kind smile, the way she used to hum along when he practiced. He remembered her words, spoken on the last day he ever played. "The music isn't in your fingers, my love. It's in your heart. As long as your heart is beating, the music is still there." He opened his eyes again, his expression calm and clear. He lifted his hands from his knees and hovered them over the keys. For a moment they trembled, uncertain. The whole room leaned in, a collective intake of breath. The silence was so complete he could hear the ticking of a mantelpiece clock on the far side of the room. Then, with a gentleness that was surprising, he let his fingers fall. The first note was not a mistake, but it was simple. A single, clear C note in the middle of the keyboard. It hung in the air, pure and clean, a question posed to the silent room. Then another note, and another. He began to play a simple, childlike melody, the kind of tune one might learn in their first week of lessons. Sterling and his group exchanged triumphant glances, their smirks widening. They had been right. It was a joke. But the people who were truly listening, who had closed their eyes to hear the music, not the spectacle, sensed something else. There was a quiet confidence in those simple notes, a deliberate pacing that felt less like a beginner's fumble and more like a story being told, one simple word at a time. The simple, childlike melody continued for a few more bars. It was the kind of tune that might have been played on a music box, sweet and uncomplicated. Sterling leaned over to his date, a triumphant smirk on his face, and whispered just loud enough for those nearby to hear, "See? I told you. 5 more minutes of this and we can ask for our money back for the entertainment." His friends chuckled, their confidence restored. They had been right all along. It was just an old man lost in a fantasy, a sad little moment they could laugh about later. Even the mater Diem peer, standing by his station, felt a knot of pity tighten in his stomach. He had made a mistake. This wasn't a hidden genius. It was a public display of delusion, and he had allowed it to happen in his restaurant. But then something changed. It was so subtle at first that almost no one noticed. In the middle of a simple, ascending scale, Arthur's finger landed on a note that didn't belong. It was a dissonant, slightly jarring sound, a single sour cherry in a bowl of sweet ones. A few people winced. Sterling's smirk widened. This was the beginning of the end, the moment the whole thing would fall apart. But the old man didn't stop. He didn't correct himself. Instead, he held that wrong note, letting it hang in the air for a beat longer than was comfortable. And then, from his left hand, a deep, resonant chord bloomed underneath it. The sour note was no longer a mistake. It was the foundation of something new. The simple melody fractured, and from the cracks a new, more complex tune began to emerge. It was like watching a black and white photograph slowly bleed into color. The childlike tune was still there, but it was now hiding in the background, a ghost haunting a new, vibrant melody. The pace quickened. The notes, which had been plodding and polite, now began to run, chasing each other up and down the keyboard. Arthur's hands, which had looked so frail and spotted just moments before, began to move with a life of their own. The tremor was gone. In its place was a fluid, confident grace. His right hand danced across the ivory keys, while his left hand provided a rumbling, powerful bass line that you could feel in your chest. A deep thrumming that seemed to match the suddenly accelerated heartbeats of everyone in the room. The string quartet members were the first to truly understand. The cellist, her bow frozen in mid-air, stared with wide, unblinking eyes. The violinist leaned forward, his head cocked, a look of profound concentration on his face. They weren't just hearing music. They were witnessing a masterclass. They were hearing history being made. The simple tune had been a key, and Arthur had just unlocked a door to a world they never expected to find. The music began to tell a story. It spoke of bustling city streets with frantic, cascading notes that sounded like car horns and hurried footsteps. Then it would soften, morphing into a theme of deep, aching loneliness, a single, mournful melody played high on the keyboard that sounded like a cry in the dark. A woman at a table across the room, who had been checking her phone, slowly put it down, her eyes welling up with tears for a reason she couldn't explain. The music was touching something inside her, something old and forgotten. Her husband reached across the table and took her hand, his own deal-making forgotten. Sterling's laughter had died in his throat. The smirk had been wiped from his face, replaced by a look of utter confusion. He looked at his friends, but they were no longer looking at him. Their faces were turned toward the piano, their expressions a mixture of disbelief and awe. He tried to whisper another joke, but the words wouldn't come. The music was too loud, too powerful. It was filling up every corner of the room, leaving no space for mockery. It demanded to be heard, to be felt. He watched as Arthur's body began to sway with the rhythm. The old man was no longer sitting on the bench. He was part of the piano, an extension of the wood and strings. His eyes were closed, his head tilted back, a look of pure, unadulterated bliss on his face. He was somewhere else, lost in the world he was creating. The melody shifted again, this time into something wild and joyful. It was a whirlwind of sound, a celebration of life and movement. The notes tumbled over each other, fast and furious, a dizzying, breathtaking display of skill that was less like a performance and more like a force of nature. It was the sound of a young man falling in love, of a heart beating wildly, of a life lived at full speed. You could hear the laughter in the music, the tears, the arguments, the reconciliations. It was a whole lifetime packed into a few minutes of sound. The young couple on their first date, who had been nervously making small talk, were now staring at the piano, completely mesmerized, their hands intertwined under the table. The music was telling their story, and then, as suddenly as it had begun, the whirlwind stopped. The frantic energy receded, leaving behind a single, beautiful melody that was both sad and hopeful. It was the sound of looking back on a long life, of accepting the losses and cherishing the joys. It was the sound of peace. Arthur played this final theme with a gentle touch, his hands caressing the keys. The notes were soft and clear like raindrops on a quiet pond. Each one seemed to hang in the air for a perfect moment before fading away. He was no longer the prodigy, the showman. He was just an old man sharing his soul. He played a final, delicate chord, and then let his hands rest in his lap. The silence that followed was the most profound sound in the entire evening. It was a heavy, sacred silence, thick with the ghost of the music that had just filled the room. No one moved. No one spoke. The clinking of glasses, the rustle of napkins, the distant hum of the city outside, it had all vanished. There was only the quiet, shared experience of a room full of people who had just been taken on a journey they never expected. They were not diners in a fancy restaurant anymore. They were a congregation, and the old man at the piano had just delivered the sermon of their lives. Sterling sat frozen, his face pale, his mouth slightly agape. The cruel amusement had been completely replaced by a dawning, humiliating realization. He hadn't just been wrong. He had been a fool. And in the heavy, reverent silence, everyone knew it. The silence in the restaurant was a living thing. It was heavy and thick, pressing down on the shoulders of every single person present. It wasn't an empty silence, but one filled to the brim with the echoes of the music that had just ceased. The notes seemed to hang in the air like invisible dust motes, shimmering with the memory of the story they had told. No one dared to move. Waiters, who had been halfway through serving the next course, were frozen in place, their arms outstretched. Diners held their forks midway to their mouths, their eyes wide and unfocused, still seeing the whirlwind of sound in their minds. The only movement was the gentle flicker of candlelight. Casting dancing shadows on the stunned faces, Sterling sat as if he had been turned to stone. The color had drained from his face, leaving it a pale, waxy mask. His mouth, which had been curved into a confident smirk just minutes before, was now slightly agape. The expensive wine in his glass suddenly tasted sour. The perfectly cooked steak on his plate looked like bland, gray meat. He felt a cold knot of dread tighten in his stomach. He looked around the room and saw that no one was paying any attention to him or his table anymore. The entire world, his world of importance and influence, had shrunk to the small, stooped figure sitting at the piano. He had tried to make a fool of the old man, but in the end the fool had been him, and the whole world had been invited to watch. It was the man at the table across the room who broke the spell. He was an older gentleman with a neatly trimmed white beard and glasses perched on the end of his nose. He was known to some as Alistair, a notoriously harsh music critic for the national newspaper, a man whose words could make or break a career. He slowly, deliberately pushed his chair back and stood up. The soft scrape of the chair legs was like a gunshot in the quiet room. Every head turned toward him. He didn't look at anyone else. His eyes were fixed on Arthur, a look of profound, almost reverent awe on his face. He began to clap. It was not the polite, perfunctory applause one gives after a background performance. It was a slow, rhythmic, powerful clap. Each strike of his hands was a declaration, a statement of respect that was so solid and real it seemed to have a weight of its own. He walked toward the piano, his applause never ceasing, a solitary figure in a sea of stillness. As he moved, another person stood up, then another, and another. A wave of realization was passing through the room. They hadn't just been entertained. They had been privileged. They had witnessed something extraordinary, something that went far beyond a simple dinner tune. Alistair reached the piano just as Arthur was about to slide off the bench. The old man looked tired, the energy of the performance seeming to have drained him, leaving him looking his age once more. That was impossible, Alistair said, his voice thick with emotion. He had finally stopped clapping, his hands now resting on the back of a nearby chair. The way you fused an impressionistic harmony with the syncopated rhythms. I haven't heard anything like it since I was a student in Vienna. It was like listening to Debussy and Thelonious Monk having a conversation. He spoke not as a critic, but as a humble student in the presence of a master. Arthur looked up, his eyes a little clouded, as if he were just waking from a long dream. He gave a small, shy smile. It was just a little something I remembered, he said, his voice quiet and raspy. A little something? Alistair let out a short, incredulous laugh. Sir, that was a masterpiece. The technical perfection alone was astounding, but the emotion, the soul you poured into those keys. Who are you? Where have you been hiding? It was at that moment that Jean-Pierre, the mater d', who had been standing frozen by his station, finally moved. He had heard the name Debussy and Monk, and it had triggered a dusty, forgotten memory in the back of his mind. A story an old chef had told him years ago about a young pianist who had set the Parisian jazz scene on fire in the 1960s. A prodigy who could play anything he heard and improvise with a genius that hadn't been seen before or since. A young man who had vanished without a trace after a terrible accident. A ghost who haunted the halls of music history. Jean-Pierre walked quickly toward the small group gathering around the piano, his usual practiced gait replaced by an urgent, almost clumsy stride. His face was pale, his eyes wide with a dawning, earth-shattering realization. He pushed past the waiter, his gaze locked on the old man. Penelagon, he whispered, the name barely audible. Not the Arthur Penelagon? The name hung in the air. For most of the diners, it meant nothing. But for Alistair, the music critic, it was like a lightning strike. His jaw dropped. He stared at Arthur, his mind racing, connecting the dots. The impossible technique, the unique style, the profound emotion, it all fit. The legend of the ghost of the keys, the prodigy who vanished 50 years ago. It couldn't be. Arthur simply gave a slow, tired nod. He didn't seem surprised that Jean-Pierre knew the name. He just looked sad, as if the name itself carried a heavy weight. The effect on the room was instantaneous. A gasp rippled through the crowd. People who hadn't understood the musical genius suddenly understood the historical significance. They weren't just in the presence of a talented amateur. They were in the presence of a lost legend. The whispers began, a frantic, excited murmur that swept through the dining room like a wildfire. Did he say Penelagon? The ghost of the keys? I thought he was a myth. My grandfather used to talk about him. And then the applause started again. This time it wasn't just one man. It was everyone. The entire dining room rose to its feet in a thundering, deafening ovation. It was a roar of appreciation, of apology, of sheer, unadulterated awe for the man they had just mocked, the legend they had just discovered. The sound was so loud it seemed to shake the very foundations of the restaurant. In the midst of the standing ovation, Sterling and his friends were shrinking in their seats. They were the only ones not standing. The applause wasn't just for Arthur. It was a silent judgment on them. Every pair of eyes that turned their way was filled with a mixture of pity and contempt. Sterling felt the heat of shame creep up his neck, a hot, prickling sensation that was unbearable. He couldn't stay here another second. He fumbled for his wallet, pulled out a thick wad of bills, and threw it onto the table without even looking at the total. He grabbed his date's arm and muttered, "We're leaving." They didn't need to be told twice. They scurried from their seats, their heads down, and made a beeline for the exit. As they pushed through the door, the roar of the applause behind them sounded like a symphony of their own disgrace. Arthur, for his part, seemed overwhelmed by the adulation. He gave a humble, awkward bow to the cheering crowd, his hand resting on the piano for support. He wasn't a showman. He was a quiet man who had shared a piece of his soul. He nodded to Alistair and Jean-Pierre, a silent acknowledgement of their respect, and then slowly made his way back to his table. He sat down, the world's most unlikely celebrity, and looked at the now cold plate of food that had been his reason for coming here in the first place. The roar of the crowd continued, but for him, the quiet had already returned. The thunderous applause eventually died down, but the energy in the room remained electric, a low hum of excitement and disbelief. It was the kind of silence that follows a great storm, when the air feels clean and new and every sound seems sharper, more meaningful. Arthur sat alone at his small table, the center of a universe of attention he had never asked for. He looked down at his plate. The main course, a coq au vin that had smelled so wonderful when it arrived, was now cold. The rich, dark sauce had congealed, and the tender pieces of chicken looked sad and unappetizing. He didn't mind. He wasn't hungry for food anymore. The performance had fed a part of him that had been starved for half a century. He picked up his fork and took a small, tentative bite. It was cold, but he chewed it slowly, with the same quiet deliberation he had shown at the piano. He was an island of profound calm in a sea of swirling emotions. Around him, conversations were happening in hushed, urgent whispers. People were pulling out their phones, not to post on social media, but to search for the name Arthur Penelagon, the ghost of the Keys. They were discovering the old articles, the faded black and white photographs of a young man with a fiery look in his eyes, a prodigy who had been destined for greatness before he simply vanished, Jean-Pierre. The maître d' stood by his station watching the old man. His professional mask was gone, replaced by an expression of deep, humbled respect. He felt a wave of shame wash over him as he remembered his initial reluctance, his condescending condition to play quietly. He had seen thousands of wealthy and powerful people come through his doors, celebrities and politicians, but none of them possessed a fraction of the quiet power he had just witnessed. He had almost been a part of the mockery, a cog in the machine of casual cruelty, and the thought made him feel small. Taking a deep breath, he walked over to Arthur's table. He moved with a new humility, his shoulders not quite so stiff. He stopped beside the old man and waited for him to finish his bite. "Monsieur Penelagon," he said, his voice soft and sincere. "There are no words." "Please allow me." "Your meal, of course, is on the house. It is the very least we can do." Arthur looked up, his eyes clear and calm. He gave a small, gentle shake of his head. "That's very kind of you, but I insist on paying. I came here for a meal, and I enjoyed it very much." He said it with such simple honesty that Jean-Pierre felt another pang of respect. This wasn't a man looking for a handout or special treatment. He was just a man who had wanted to play the piano, before Jean-Pierre could argue. Alistair, the music critic, approached the table. He held a small, elegant business card in his hand, which he offered to Arthur with a respectful bow. "Sir," he began, his voice filled with genuine reverence, "I know you are a man who values his privacy, and I would never dream of intruding. But what you shared with us tonight, it's not just music, it's history. It's a piece of the world's soul that we thought was lost forever. I would be honored if you would consider speaking with me, not for a newspaper article, but for the historical record." "Just to talk?" "Whenever you are ready. No pressure at all." Arthur took the card, looked at it for a moment, and then placed it carefully in his tweed jacket pocket. "Thank you," he said simply. He didn't make any promises. He just accepted the gesture with a quiet nod. A young woman, who had been dining with her parents at a nearby table, hesitantly approached. She couldn't have been more than 20. She had tears in her eyes. I'm a music student, she stammered. And I just wanted to say, thank you. I've never felt anything like that. You reminded me why I started playing in the first place. She didn't ask for an autograph or a selfie. She just wanted to express her gratitude, and then she quickly returned to her table. Her face flushed with emotion. Arthur watched her go, and for the first time that evening, a genuine, warm smile spread across his face. It was a soft, wrinkled smile that reached his eyes. This was the connection he had missed, not the fame or the applause, but the simple act of touching another person's soul with his music. He finished his cold meal, savoring each bite as if it were a feast. When he was done, he carefully placed his knife and fork together on the plate, folded his napkin, and pushed his chair back. The movement was a signal. The spell was broken. He was leaving. Jean-Pierre rushed over. Please, monsieur, let me call you a car. That won't be necessary, Arthur said, his voice kind but firm. I enjoy the walk. It's a lovely night. He reached into his pocket and pulled out an old leather wallet. He took out a few bills and placed them on the table, more than enough to cover his meal and a generous tip. For the wonderful service, he said to Jean-Pierre, giving him a small, knowing look. The maître d' felt his throat tighten. He picked up the money, but it felt heavy in his hand like a sacred object. He walked Arthur to the door, parting the sea of diners who all watched in reverent silence. As they reached the entrance, Jean-Pierre held the door open for him. Monsieur, he said one last time, the piano. It will never be just for decoration again. Arthur paused at the threshold, looking out into the cool night air. He turned back to Jean-Pierre. It never was, he said softly. Then he nodded a final farewell and stepped out. Into the quiet street, the walk home was different from the walk to the restaurant. The city lights seemed to glow a little brighter. The distant sounds of traffic seemed to blend into a gentle, rhythmic hum. He didn't feel the weight of the stairs or the pressure of the expectations. He felt light. He felt whole. The ghost that had been haunting him for 50 years was not a monster to be feared, but a memory to be embraced. The music wasn't a source of pain anymore. It was a part of him, as natural as breathing. He thought of the man, Sterling, and his cruel laughter. He didn't feel anger or a sense of victory. He just felt a quiet pity. The man's mistake wasn't just that he had misjudged an old man in a tweed jacket. His mistake was that he had forgotten how to listen, not just with his ears, but with his heart. He had been so busy making noise that he couldn't hear the beauty in the silence. Arthur arrived at his small, modest apartment and unlocked the door. Inside, everything was just as he had left it, quiet, simple, but it felt different now. The silence was no longer empty. It was filled with the echo of the music, the memory of the applause, and the warmth of the connections he had made. He walked over to the window and looked out at the city. He was still the same quiet man who lived a simple life. But tonight he had reminded the world and himself that the quietest souls can sometimes hold the most powerful music. And that was more than enough.